My name is Karen Elizabeth Williamson. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri on December 20th, 1947.
Thank you. I think it would be nice to begin with your childhood in St. Louis.
Yes.
And if you could just tell us what that was like. What was, you know, it can be family, it can be the community, whatever you'd like to say.
Okay. Well, I always say St. Louis is a great place to be from. I am the middle child, the only girl.
How many?
There's 3 of us. I have 2 brothers, and we're each 4.5 years apart, which my mother said she did intentionally so that each of us would have our own little space. My parents were not from St. Louis. They each had moved from other places. And when they got, my mother was born and raised in Yonkers, New York, went to Hunter College, did her, got a graduate degree in social work from Smith, I think in 1942, and then had difficulty finding a job for a black social worker. So she wrote letters all over the country and actually saved them. I still have many of them where places would write back and, you know, we don't hire Negro social workers, or we have our one, or whatever. So she eventually found a position with a social service agency in Dayton, Ohio. My father was born and raised in West Virginia, went to Ohio State University for college, and then was in journalism and was working with a newspaper in Dayton. And I believe he, you know, he wrote the Black Page or whatever it was. There was a section in the paper, and he went to interview my mother, who was the first black social worker, Negro social worker in Dayton, and that's how they met. And then he ended up accepting a job in St. Louis. So I think they, and again, I don't know all the details, but they got married and then they moved to St. Louis. So, you know, we didn't have other family there, but you know, they established a life there, and it was really I feel, you know, a wonderful childhood. I mean, I probably was more ignorant of, you know, so many things. They sheltered us in many ways, but you know, we were not wealthy, but we were, I think, a solid black middle class family in St. Louis City. My mother continued to work in social work, but she took time off when I was born and then went back to work when my younger brother, you know, started school. So, and my father worked in journalism, primarily with black newspapers in St. Louis, and then went on to become a professional photographer. And you know, he just was, you know, a businessman in some ways, in terms of, you know, being on the Y board and the savings and loan board, and just involved with things. So, you know, we had a pretty safe, and we lived in always lived in, I shouldn't say we always lived in black neighborhoods, but, you know, we lived very much in what was certainly the black community, although when I was 8, we did move to a white neighborhood. And
what was that like?
Well,
remember how old were you?
I was about 8. What I remember is one night my mother drove me, and I don't know why it was just me, but we were out, and she drove by a house that was across the street from a park, and we parked at night, and she said, "That's where we're going to live." And she had never been inside the house. Obviously, none of the children hadn't, and my father had to go with a white man, and went as the handyman, or went as just, I'm not even sure exactly how they described him, but anyway, he went, and somehow or other, I don't know the details. It's interesting, and I look back and I wish I'd asked more, but I know that they bought the house with cash, and we moved in without people really knowing. And as I said, it was an all-white neighborhood. It changed pretty quickly after that. I don't really remember many of the neighbors. There was one boy that was the same age as one of my brothers, and so his family stayed pretty long compared to some of the others. There were no girls on the neighborhood, so we continued to socialize. Our black church, we were in Jack and Jill, in Girl Scouts, and many other anchoring activities. So we did those, but I don't remember really having friends in the neighborhood. But it changed quickly and was still pretty solid neighborhood. It was facing a park in North St. Louis. So. And pretty soon, as I said, there were people on the block that we knew. So, what was good about it, one of my Sunday school teachers, one of my eventual teachers lived on the block. So, it really was a neighborhood of people that you live with, but also knew in many other ways.
Could you speak about the community and how it was supportive? For someone who might, for someone who doesn't know, hasn't lived, we're talking about a segregated time.
Mm-hmm.
I know that St. Louis was different. I mean,
right.
I know it, but still, for someone who doesn't know that world, it seems to me there was a very strong community. And I wondered if you could just give us a glimpse into that community.
Well, I think there were many communities or many ways that our family created community. So I don't really know what the community is,
Sure.
but we were involved with the church, obviously, and there were people that we saw, although we weren't big churchgoers. My father was active, but so that was a group. Jack and Jill was a very important organization for African American families at that time. So there were.
Talk about Jack and Jill.
Well, it's interesting because now, in retrospect, I may have a very different, or I have conflicting views. Sure. But at the time, yes. It was certainly an organization that provided structured activities for.
Who started it? Do you know?
It's a national organization. I'm not sure whether it started. I'd have to go back and pull out the history, but it was a national organization. It wasn't founded in St. Louis,
Yes,
but
yes,
my mother, I think, was involved in helping to found the St. Louis chapter. But it was a national organization. A group of women would come together and start a chapter, and they then would be chartered by or recognized by the national organization. And now it's quite a behemoth in terms of all kinds of rules, stuff like that. But there was a group of friends
Yes.
that started the organization, and the rules were that the parents had to be involved, the mothers, had to help plan activities for each of their children or the age groups of the children. So many obviously families got to know each other. At the time, of course, there was a little snootiness in terms of who could get in, and you had to be voted in and stuff like that. So it was certainly perceived to be elitist, and probably
Yes.
was. But at the time, it was those were the people that I knew, and even though we didn't go to school together because we might live in different parts of the city,
That was the group that
there were always things going on there. Then my mother was involved with a bridge club, and Malik's mother was in the bridge club, so Entre knew they were together for decades, and there were just different organizations and groups that did things so that you never knew you were excluded from a wider world, because you really didn't know. I didn't know what that wider world was. So at the time, we didn't go out to eat. There was one black restaurant that, if it was a really special occasion, we might go there. But, I didn't know I couldn't go to a restaurant, Yeah. And then there were families that would get together. I can remember, every New Year's Eve, our family hosted about 8 families, and, potluck. And my mother would provide the chitlins and certain food, and everybody would come. And our house wasn't that huge, but people were all over, and it was a thing that we did for my whole growing up. So again, there were always things that groups of families did, or that the women did, or through Jack and Jill we did. So we were in a bubble, maybe. Maybe that's the way to describe it, but it was a bubble that we created, and So it wasn't until you got out in the real world later on that you just, oh my God, I was not aware of things. And obviously maybe I should have put more together, in terms of, oh, your family has to buy a house and your mother can't even see the house before you buy it. Maybe that should have been, just an alert as to what the world was. But, it was presented as that's how we were going to do it, so.
And what was school like? If you can speak, K through 12, and especially, what was that like?
Okay. In my, before we moved to the new house, we lived in a black neighborhood, and I started at a local school called Brilliant School, and, and as I said, the teachers were people I knew from church or neighborhood or something, or just knew. And then around maybe fifth or sixth grade, they started something called the gifted program. And so students were tested and selected to go to, I guess certain magnet schools or certain schools that had the gifted program. So my first year, I remember going to a black school. It wasn't my neighborhood school, but it was black school of gifted students. And again, many of them were people I knew from Jack and Jill. I mean, many of them were friends. But then, and again, I feel badly being reflective because it's like, I really never thought about some of these things. But after the first year in that program, I ended up being transferred to another school, Ashland School, which had a gifted program, which was actually closer to our new house. So it may have been just a result of the move. I never put all this together, but and so for a couple of years, I don't really have a lot of memories of that. I actually don't have hardly any memories of it, but I wasn't the only black student. I did that. But for high school, I will say my parents were firm believers in sort of education. I mean, that was the thing. My grandfather, my mother's father had gone to NYU. I mean, so education, and obviously, both of them had done very well for their generation to go to the schools they went to. So my older brother went to a private boarding school in St. Louis that was pretty progressive. They wanted me to go to wanted me to explore boarding school or some kind of private school, and I wasn't wild, but it's like, oh no, I didn't want to do that. But I couldn't go. My mother wasn't going to let me go to the public school, high school that all my friends went to. So I ended up going to a Lutheran high school, even though we weren't Lutheran. But it was a very integrated school and very small. So, I had both black and white friends there. It was popular. But I do remember, I was active with the yearbook and active with, other organizations. And after, spending 2 or 3 years in progressive roles for the yearbook, when I was a senior, when it would have been expected, or I certainly expected that I would be the yearbook editor, that was the first year they decided we need to have co-editors. So, I was paired with another student who I liked, but, I never, that felt weird. I didn't understand that. And in retrospect, I see it very differently. At the time, I was just disappointed, but I have, since put a racial lens on it. But generally, it was, a good experience. There were more issues probably with the fact that it was a parochial school, and when it was time to go to college, and my older brother had gone to Brown. As I said, so in terms of schools, we were looking at my mother was, I want you to look at, the Ivies, so, and at that time single sex, so Wellesley, Smith, Holyoke, Pembroke, all those schools. So when I went to talk to my guidance counselor about college and mentioned that those were the schools that I was interested in, You know, she kind of like, you can't, what do you know, I mean, one, I don't think she was that familiar with them, but two, I mean, it was just like, why don't you look at, Lutheran Concordia and, some of these, Midwestern, so, she just, oh, you can't get in, I mean, really very discouraging. And of course, when I told my mother, it's like, okay, so we just, didn't spend a lot of time accessing their services, which were, not very helpful. And again, some of it was race, but some of it was just like, you ought to go to this little Midwest.
Why are you aiming so high?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And to this day, I remember my graduation, and Lutheran, there was a Lutheran High Central, which later became Lutheran North, and a Lutheran High South, which was out in the suburbs and all white. But the graduations were held jointly at an auditorium in St. Louis. And I remember when, they call your name and where you're going to school. And I remember a gas or something. I mean, it's like, my name and just ruffling or something. I mean, there was just a reaction to Wellesley College. And I don't know whether, how you.
From the audience.
Yes. And don't ask me, because I don't remember anything else in life. You ask me any other detail, and it's like, I don't remember. But I, remember just the response. Maybe it was appreciation, maybe it was, who knows, but just it was, the counselor, obviously, when I came and told her the news was, very surprised or, I guess, embarrassed to be wrong, but just, I mean, just, but I do remember there was like, how could, how's she going there? Something, but as I said, my, those are some of the things that you sort of think about now.
So your grandfather went to NYU?
My grandfather was a civil engineer, became a civil engineer, and was Phi Beta Kappa at NYU. And so, he was quite distinguished in his community. Of course, this was in Yonkers, New York, and, I know that when it was time, there was an opportunity for him to become the city engineer. He was not given that job. So I know that that was a real hurt for him. And even though I was a child, how you hear about that. So he was quite a smart, interesting man. Yeah.
So Wellesley.
Yes.
What was that like?
That was a life-changing experience. It really was.
You must have been very excited to have gotten into Wellesley, no?
Yes.
Because you worked hard.
Yes. Yes. I think I was ignorant, though. I mean, I knew what it was, but 50 years looking back on it, it's like, wow, I mean, it is, and it certainly had such an impact on my life in so many ways. Not only the friendships that I made, but just in so many other ways. So, but I think at the time, certainly I was excited because that was my first choice. I fell in love with the school when I went to visit it. I did not know that Fran Rousson Wilson was also, I mean, we had never talked. We did not know that we both had applied to Wellesley, even though our mothers were in the Bridge Group and we were, other organizations together. But, we didn't talk about those things. So that was really a delightful surprise. But I think I was more, I was excited but apprehensive. I mean, obviously you would be apprehensive going away to any school, but I think, I always say, I went to Wellesley as this sort of nice Negro girl. And during those 4 years, really, sort of came out as a black woman, partly because of the times. I mean, the late 60s.
It's the 60s.
Yes. And I mean, I've never been a very rebellious or very, outspoken. I wasn't before then. But I really came into a sense of self. Now, I was far from being a radical, or anyone on the extreme, but our experiences at Wellesley really exposed us to very blatant racism. In fact, we started the Black student group, and I'm sure you've heard these stories, but but I'll tell them anyway. When there were, as it turned out, there were 6 black women in a class of about 400, and I had a roommate who turned out to be Alvia Wardlaw, who was a black woman from Houston. I think Nancy Gist wanted a single and got a single. Janet McDonald Hill was roomed with another black student, Frida J. Cox. And then Fran Roussan was placed in an experiment and had a Jewish roommate. And as we later found out, the Jewish parents had been contacted to see if it was all right if their daughter roomed with a black student. But of course, the reverse didn't happen. But anyway, so as we, kind of got to know each other, and it's like, wow, what a coincidence, we have these black roommates, and you didn't really, it was comforting.
Yes.
But at the same time, you didn't go there to be with a black roommate. Now, obviously things changed later when, black students demanded to live together and have black housing and stuff like that. But at the time, you expected to be part of and expected to, figure out how to navigate this larger community. So black, 6 of us, 5 of us kind of, talked, and this isn't right. We should go talk to the, head of housing. And we went to, isn't it coincidence? How did this happen? And, she was very straightforward in saying, well, we put you together because we thought you would be more comfortable with each other. She just basically patted us on the head, and as it turned out, they did that with Jewish students, they did it with Catholic students, they did it with all kinds of students. So we said, well, we didn't come here for that. So she promised she would never do that again. So the following year, I believe there were maybe 7, and I may have my numbers wrong, 7 African American students, all of them had singles, whether they wanted a roommate or not. So her, solution was, I'll never put you together, but I'm still not ready to room you with white students. So based on that action, we got very upset and started, sort of organizing and actually reaching outside of the college to say, this Wellesley, is not what we thought. It's, not treating us well. So, and that was really the beginning of our black student group ethos, which, exists to this very day. And I was.
How did that go? How did you, as you started to organize, what was the administration's response, and how did that go?
Well, I can tell you, it ended up with us threatening a hunger strike. So, a year or 2 later, so it did, reach ahead where we were sitting across a negotiating table with the president of the college. But, initially, you're talking to people, and of course, at that time, black students were making noises everywhere, and women's rights were rising, and the Vietnam War. So we were just one of many voices that were complaining about how we were being treated and what was going on in the world. So other students were very supportive of our movement because again, everybody was protesting or doing something. I think we. I don't think the administration was openly hostile, but if things don't change, that just means that, right. So we did, we sent a letter to an organization that supported black students, a Nesfinesse, that was a scholarship service for Negro students, and I think we found out that the wife of the chair or somebody had a Wellesley connection. And so there were 5 of us who were active at that time because one of the black students left. But so we all went to mail the letter to this outside organization because we figured if one person mailed it, they could put that one person, that one student could be expelled if some, if they ever caught us. But if all of us touched the letter and mailed it, they wouldn't dare put everybody out. I mean, that was so that was the way we were kind of working together and meeting in rooms and I mean, we had an organization just like all kinds of student organizations, but we really were very collaborative and kind of working together. So when we sent the letter externally, everything is good until you have external, until the light shines from outside and people, what are you doing to those poor students? And that's when, we started, getting sort of a little negative feedback or just, how, people were not happy. But as I said, things progressed and we started asking for more things. I mean, the housing, I guess, I don't know whether it was our 3rd or 4th year they finally changed the housing. But, then we,
Did you get to room with white students?
Yes, and I don't know whether that was our junior or our senior year, but it took a while. But they finally said, okay, we'll try, and again, I can't remember exactly, when that happened, but it only happens once a year, so yeah, right. You'd see what happened, and then you have to wait till the next September till the next class came. But at that time, people were talking about, African American studies. There were all kinds of other activities other demands we had. So by the time, I guess, our junior year, maybe we, had a whole list of demands and presented them to the administration. And that's when we threatened a hunger strike. If you don't, concede to these demands, we're gonna go on a hunger strike. And we actually got newspaper coverage.
Outside of the Wellesley newspaper.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the president of the college, we wanted an increase in the number of students. They recruited all kinds of things that weren't probably not realistic or maybe not possible immediately, but they eventually did agree to most of the demands or, a pathway forward, including the establishment of an African American house, which again, Harambe House is now, a sort of a black student center now that's still on campus. We asked for a black psychologist because they were making us crazy. I mean, that was one other thing. And of course, many years later, I mean, mental health for students, was a bigger issue. So many of those things have, come to pass. But, by that, I guess, by my senior year, obviously, we begin to look about
you guys
to the future.
Made changes.
Yeah, we definitely did.
Did you actually do the hunger strike?
Oh no, we didn't miss a meal. No, we didn't. No, no we didn't miss a meal. No, they did agree to. I mean, we didn't need to. It's not that we blinked, but they agreed to our quote demands or the things that we were trying to. So, and in retrospect, we learned, or later on, as we got a chance to go through the archives of the school and see things. The president of the college, who Ruth Adams, who, I mean, I'm not saying she was sympathetic, but she certainly allowed the changes to happen. And actually, she was a new president because when we first got there, there was a different woman who was not as progressive. So the president, and she did get a lot of, I mean, we later learned how much pushback she got. There were faculty who were supportive of us, and we later learned, what kind of challenges or struggles they faced, or what kind of, maybe career damage. But, so in looking back, we only saw the surface. We didn't realize what type of, letters were coming from some alums. Not all faculty obviously were progressive. So, we learned, many decades later that there was a lot of uproar underneath what we saw.
Were there African American professors?
Not when we started, you know, and again, that was one of the demands. There were no professors, there were no staff.
None.
None. We didn't even see them in the kitchen. I think that was one of the things. They're not even, you know, black cooks here. What, you know? So no, there were none of that when we started. No.
But by the time you left?
There were, I don't know whether any professors were actually hired. There might have been an instructor or two, but you know, there were, we could take courses at MIT. We could take courses.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And so I did have at least one or two by my senior year, but you know, it takes a while to do that.
And that, you know, now I'm not familiar directly with Wellesley, but there were interactions, there were socials with Harvard, right? I mean, what was that like for these African American women? There's 7 of you, you said.
There were, well, in our class started with
You're
6.
you're 6,
But
okay.
but there was one junior when we got there.
Okay.
Or she was a sophomore actually. There were no juniors and there were 3 seniors. So totally on campus,
Total on campus are 7?
Less than 10.
Less than 10.
Over the
okay.
4 years, yeah.
So, weren't there, like, didn't people from Harvard come to Wesley and Wesley go to Harvard for social events and all that? What was that like?
Well,
Was it just normal? I mean, was it okay?
you say like, what's normal? You know? It wasn't normal for many reasons, you know. But you know, there were numbers of African American students at all the other schools.
Sure,
So
yes.
those
Probably more. Like Harvard probably
had more just because they were bigger,
Big,
you know.
yes, yes.
And so, well, those socials were kind of weird anyway. I mean, you know, in terms of
Yes.
meeting people. So I don't, you know, I mean, everybody may have done 1 or 2. I mean, you're more likely to go with other women in the dorm. But that was not a,
It wasn't
that wasn't a big part of it. Now, there was, Yale University did organize something which became known as Spook Weekend, where black students from all of the sort of colleges in that area would go to Yale for a weekend. And as I understand it, they got the school to do it because they included some type of a educational element to, you know, speakers or stuff. But what I remember, and I think what most people remember, would be the party, and that would be, you know, the opportunity to really meet other African Americans in, you know, in that part of the, you know, other students. So you know, the mixers weren't really a big part of my experience, just because, you know, it wasn't necessarily the music we liked, and I mean, it was just sort of, you know, you were on display, or you know, everybody was. And I actually met a guy from Boston University, so and he was involved with the fraternity, so I did more things with them than I did with, you know, Harvard. But clearly, you know, we knew, you know, the guys, a group of guys, and if you know one, then everybody knows one, or if one person has a car, then 15 people are going in the car. I mean, you know, so you did a lot, you know, a lot of things together. So.
So you really made changes.
We did, as well as the changes in ourselves of, you know, finding a voice and, you know, leadership and all those other things, and bonded, as I said, the, you know, 5 of us. And, yeah, and the students who were involved with us, you know, as you know, those bonds are still extremely tight today, extremely tight. So we really.
Did you have much support from the white students?
Yes, yeah. Because again, I think that was a time where, you know, we were out to change the world, you know. So there were, you know, students who were. Some more progressive, maybe even, you know, in terms of some of the other movements. But, you know, not all of my white students were involved, but they were supportive, or, you know, they certainly weren't hostile, I'll put it like that, you know. And I think those that were just, stayed away, So, I felt, and I'm really optimistic, so,
Yes, I sense that, yes. And, I mean, so your brother also went to Brown University?
Both of my brothers went to Brown, yeah.
So your parents really emphasized education.
Education.
And of course it seems to run in the family.
It does, it does. I was going to say, I am very proud. And, I went to business school after Wellesley. Went to University of Chicago, which is not a bad school. And
it's a very good school.
Yes, well, I keep saying, but I'm the least educated in my siblings, But yeah, I would say my older brother, after Brown, went to Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and then went on later to get a law degree at George Washington. And then my younger brother Keith went to Brown, and then he got a JD MBA from Harvard, and then he went to NYU to get a master's in tax law. And then, it has certainly.
What was University of Chicago like?
That was a good experience for me too. But I am. What I remember most about Chicago will not be the academic part. Because when I went to the University of Chicago, the students who were a year ahead of us were working on having the school fund a Black MBA student conference. And I got it, I'm an organizer, I'm a joiner, so I got involved helping them with that. So that was in, I guess in the spring of my first year. But a lot of our activities, I did okay in school, so I wasn't neglecting my schoolwork, but, a lot of energy went around both the socializing and working on this conference. And the reason that conference is important is because that conference is the forerunner of the National Black MBA Association today, which is now a major organization that just celebrated its 50th anniversary. So, I was involved as sort of a secretary in helping them with the first conference, and then the following year, which was my second year at Chicago, we had a follow-up student conference with delegates from different regions. We set up regions. So we had a follow-up planning conference to kind of talk about how to continue this movement. So I graduated, ended up moving to New York. And then after I had been there a year, a friend who was a year behind me ended up moving to New York. And he had been tasked with continuing the work of setting up this national organization. So he called me, Karen, we got to do this. And so I guess I became, like the first vice president of the National Black MBA Association. We worked on, all the legal, trying to get it incorporated, trying to structure how it would be. And so, my experience there was really as being one of the founders and, being recognized as one of the founders of that organization, and how that, has really blossomed into a, really incredible.
Were there a lot of Black students at U of Chicago?
A lot is not the right word, but
right.
But there was a noticeable amount. I'll put it like that. I don't know whether it was the right amount, who knows, but there were some, and particularly because there was a consortium that had been founded by some schools a consortium to recruit Black students I guess it's to send them to MBA programs in several places, but and
what about faculty and staff at Chicago?
What about them?
Were there?
Are you asking, were there any Black ones?
Was it like Wellesley? Was it better?
I don't remember any Black faculty per se. There probably was staff, although the person who was the advocate and who really helped us do this was Dean Metcalf, who was not Black. So if there were, actually now that you're asking me that, if there were Black staff, they certainly weren't active in this, but Chicago's a much larger, entity, and so there probably, but obviously I don't remember interacting with any now that you say that. So I think 69 to 71, it was still.
What made you decide on Chicago?
This is probably
Especially you of Chicago.
Well, let me just say this, and this probably won't stay in, but well, two things. One, I was intimidated by the case method that Harvard had, and I've always been sort of more quantitative. Even I majored in economics, not necessarily because, but that was my major. I didn't, literature and reading and interpreting stuff like that was not my forte. So I didn't even think about Harvard because it's like, oh, you got to read and interpret stuff and talk about stuff. So, and Chicago obviously was a very strong school, but did not have the case method. So that was attractive to me. So I applied to Columbia and University of Chicago and got into both. But as I said, I had been dating this guy from BU who was getting a little crazy. And he thought we were going to get married right out of, and I'm like, I'm done. I mean, I'm just biding my time, So I actually went to Chicago because it was further away from Boston, and he was staying in Boston. New York was too close. So that was that was the ultimate point. Now, I had an aunt who lived in Chicago. My father had spent some time in Chicago, and it was close to St. Louis. So, it was a big city, and it was certainly a desirable place to be. But the bottom line was, what's furthest from Boston? So.
No, because Chicago is, I think, a very unique school. Of the
yes.
privates.
Yes.
It still is, I
yes.
think.
Yes.
I was curious.
Yeah.
I think they have a way of, I may be wrong, but this notion of really to come up with new ideas and new thinking is so strong in Chicago.
Right. But you're also assuming that there was a lot of logical and the informed decision making then.
Okay.
And let's start with that. So, and I think this is important to share. I actually, majored in economics, but I really didn't know, I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do while I was still at Wellesley. And so I was looking at two things. I was sort of, I was thinking about going to, I guess Brandeis had a graduate school of social science or something, I was thinking, oh, well, maybe I'll get a PhD, So that's what I was really thinking about. And I went to a black student conference at Columbia, because there was a lot of stuff going on. So this was a conference of, black student leaders. And I ended up sitting at a luncheon table with, I don't know whether it was the dean of the Columbia Business School, but somebody from Columbia. And it was like, what do you want to be when you grow up, little girl? And I said, well, I want to, be a social worker, social scientist to help my people, maybe run a poverty program because, again, those were coming, those were big. So that's what I want to do. I'm going to run one of these poverty programs. And he said to me, if you really want to help your people, you should go to business school and learn how to run a program well. A social worker, is doing one thing, but a manager, you need to learn how to run a business, run a program so that it's successful. And that was where the idea of business school came from. So I didn't really, I didn't know anything about business school. This was not something on my radar, but obviously when he said that, like, okay, that's an option, so I really started at business school. So the whole thing was really out of, I'm going to help my people. I went to business school. University of Chicago wasn't talking anything about helping black people. That was not the business environment in 1970, 69, 70. That's not their language. But, and I obviously didn't follow that path, but the marketing courses, I really fell in love with marketing because it was about how do you satisfy people's wants and desires, or just, how do you communicate, how do you find out, how do you reach those needs. So that really is what I fell in love with, and then went on, to go into consumer marketing. So that, that was really my first job. So
Nice.
that was sort of the pathway from, being out there helping the people to, corporate America and, stuff
So
like.
where did you end up with your first job?
My first job was at Philip Morris in New York. Philip Morris was, even though, cigarettes are, but Philip
Yeah.
Morris was a very strong marketing company. You think about, Virginia Slims and Marlboro and all the, that branding, and they had just been banned from television, so they were looking for magazines and sports and other kinds of ways of promoting. But it was, I was only there for 2.5 years, but it was a great experience, a lot of fun. Moved to New York City, so really, really.
Nice.
That was good. And then from there, I ended up moving to Avon in a marketing position because it finally kind of dawned on me, one, tobacco was not a woman's field. It was a little tough. And I could have stayed, but
Yeah. And was the environment good at Philip Morris?
yeah, it was fun. It really was fun. I mean, there were there were black people that I knew, one I had met even before I graduated, who had met at one of the student conferences. But, it was pretty progressive. And, the ad agencies, and they had just hired or, gave a contract to a black ad agency, which was new. So, it was like we were, that was a period when,
Yes.
people had money to spend,
Yes,
and
yes.
those liquid lunches, or just I mean, it was just a very a different. It was a fun time for a young woman here.
And Avon?
Avon was a little less fun. They were not quite as sophisticated. It was much more homegrown.
Where was this?
This was in. Both of them were in New York City.
was also
Yeah,
New York City.
Avon 9 West 57th, was a, and Philip Morris is right across from Grand Central Station. So 100 Park Avenue. So it was heady, New York.
Yeah.
Avon was
Avon is a little more conservative.
a little bit more conservative. It was certainly more pro women, but from a marketing, just from a professional standpoint, they did so much stuff internally. And their market was selling to the women who were going, the knock, 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 and it was, just a different
But
flavor.
But you enjoyed it?
I enjoyed both. Some reasons I didn't enjoy Avon were more personality, or I had a boss who I didn't get along with, so. There were other things that influenced it, but still love marketing, and it was a good time,
And after that?
I got married while I was at Avon, and then we decided after I had been in New York 5 years, and New York was starting, that's when, they had the garbage strike and, dog poop everywhere. New York was just, and we just decided we were ready to leave New York, and whoever found a job first in a city that the other person wanted, we would do. And my husband, had a job in about a month in Washington, D.C., and, I had a brother here, and, it was an easy place to be, so that's how I came to D.C. in '76 and haven't left. Yeah.
So looking back on your childhood,
Mhm.
it seems like generally you were, it was a very good, happy childhood, from what you've said. Is
Yes,
that-
I think it was a great
Beautiful.
childhood.
Yeah.
It was very supportive. I think a lot of it is that I had, wonderful parents. I was very fortunate to have, wonderful, strong parents who, were not, as I said, I think I had everything I needed, and, might not have had, the biggest this or the most that, but, the values and what was important, and, the attention, and.
And where was the rest of the extended family?
My mother's family was all still in New York, and every summer we went to New York and maybe spend a month in Yonkers. So that's where I got to spend time with grandparents and cousins and other folks like that. So so I feel pretty connected to them. My father's family. My father parents were deceased before I was born, and he had 3 other siblings, and none of them had children, which is very interesting. You know, we don't. So I, you know, don't have. You know, we were, and they were mostly in. Well, one relative was in Chicago, his sister, and the other 2 brothers were in Ohio, and you know they died relatively young, you know, before I was in college. So. But the aunt in Chicago was still there when I went to school there, so that was.
But the summers were in New York.
We would go for at least a month in you know, so my mother and me and my brothers might go, but again, they were, you know, there's a 9-year difference, so, but one would be at camp or, you know, so they would do stuff, but yeah, so.
And it seems like in St. Louis, your family actually, in a sense, changed the neighborhood. That was all white. And
well, one block,
yeah. In one block.
Yeah, I don't.
Was it literally just one block?
I am only aware of one block.
Okay.
You know, well, you know, if you go back to St. Louis, that whole neighborhood is very, you know, it's almost, you know, it's a shame to see what has happened to that neighborhood. But as I said, I'm aware of the block that we lived on, and obviously, I'm sure all up and down Kossuth Avenue, you know, the change happened. But you know, my world was really, you know, the block that we stayed on. Yeah.
So, given your experience, I'm wondering, what if you were to give advice to the younger generation of African Americans? What would you say today?
I would certainly. Oh my goodness, that's a great question. Because when we look at today's world, you know, the pendulum is, you know, swinging back, and you know, some of the things that we thought were givens are not givens anymore. I mean, I guess the advice I would give to anybody is, you know, to take advantage of any opportunity. You know, take some risk. Don't limit yourself. You know, put one step in front of the other. You know, so often I look at some of the things that we did, whether it was what happened at Wellesley, whether it was what we did at the University of Chicago, and just, you know, you don't ever know what's going to happen. But you got, you know, but you move from where you are, and hopefully take a step forward, take a step up, and you will either, you know, do something or be the platform that somebody else will use to do something. So, you know, that's not a black or white thing, but I do think, you know, sometimes we limit ourselves. I know when I look back, there are times you know, maybe I played it a little too safe, or maybe, you know, I didn't take advantage of all of the opportunities that I, you know, could have taken advantage of. But, you know, and you don't let others define who you are, you know. So I, you know who you are, and realize that, you know, the world isn't yet a level playing field, and you know, there are going to be blockages or people who try to block you, but you know, try to walk through the door and leave the door open. You know, that's really, you know, so it's, you know, it's not, I don't have any big advice, you know, I don't have any.
But it's interesting how the experience at Wellesley really, I mean, I know you've given the whole tenor of what was going on in the States at that time. Obviously, you know, civil rights movement, women's movement, Vietnam. I mean, it was a very unique time, really.
That was a very unique time, yeah.
But then here you go to Wellesley College, and you know, you didn't intend to do what your group of friends accomplished.
Right.
But you stepped up.
Yeah.
You didn't think twice, it seems. You just,
and
you say it, talk.
Well, you know, how you don't know what you don't know. And that, you know, it's just the whole thing of when you find yourself in a situation and there's something you can do it. And not think about, you know, I think if we had really thought about what the long term or what the big impact, I don't think you do. But you know, it's like you take a step because you know you can take that next step, or you see a step you can take. And of course, obviously, you know, you have people with you. I mean, you know, you don't do anything, you know, necessarily without your posse, or, you know, without having support, you know, in many different forms. But you know, I don't know that I saw any of this, you know, and you didn't think about it as I'm changing the world, you know, but it's just, this isn't right, and this is something we can do about it, and let's do it.
But that's the thing, is to recognize. I mean, like you said, you weren't out to change the world. In fact, that was in your intention even when you applied to Leslie. But then when you see what the problem is, despite how difficult the problem might be, this willingness to move ahead and take that on, that's a pretty significant step. And then to go all the way to even a sort of a hunger strike. No, you know, I mean, come on, you're not very old at that time, you know?
We were pretty young and dumb, probably, but you know.
You are young people.
Yes,
I'm just
right.
saying,
But that was having the support, or having the friendships, having that,
sure.
the women, the other folks. I mean, I don't know that these were my ideas. I mean, who knows? I mean, we never, who suggested that? We don't even know where it came from. But, you know, we, you know, arm in arm or linked, you know.
But even that is impressive, to unite around a cause and to advance it.
But isn't that how the world gets changed? I mean,
but you're young people. You see, what I'm thinking about is this generation. And I don't mean it's not black or white. It's just younger generation. You know, there are so many issues that we need to tend to. In fact, more so now than I would say a decade ago or even 5 years ago. And so, you know, how do we make or try to show younger people, and I don't care what age, I'm not, you know, but younger people, this idea of, you know, if you see something that really isn't just or right, there's a responsibility here. You know, you can do something about it.
You know, when I think about the students, you know, who have been involved with some of these school shootings, and how some of them, you know, have risen up in the same way. So I do think, you know, and I think in terms of the climate, I mean, I do think there are people who are doing those things. You know, maybe there are not enough of them. Maybe, and again, I haven't really thought about it in sociology, but, you know, I mean, I don't know whether the Me Too, you know, or whether, you know, this, I mean, people are so into their devices, or, I mean, you know, or into this fantasy world. I mean, you know, I won't even begin to speculate about what it is, but maybe there are too many people who are zoned out or tuned out, who aren't willing to take just a step or to do something. But I do think that's the only way that change really happens. And as I said, the fact that we did it just shows, you know, you don't have to have a big plan, you just have to be willing to do something. And if you have people who support you, or you support each other, because as I said, you know, when we mailed that letter, it was like everybody's fingerprint was on that letter, because they weren't going to peel us off, you know. So, I mean, if you have people who are really willing together to do something, you get results.
But you know, I'm not disagreeing with you.
Okay.
But
you are. But
I am.
Okay.
And this is why. The cause you took up with your friends is different than climate change. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think it is.
Okay.
Than let's say climate change or the shootings, the school.
Okay.
Because.
Okay.
And I may be totally out of line here, and you can tell me. But you had to deal with a situation in this country which is not at all pleasant and not at all normal in terms of, I'm going to go back to the history of slavery and what this country, from its very beginning, created.
Right. So
Which
it
was a
was
pretty-
normal. When you say it wasn't normal, it was very
Well,
normal.
it was normal, but I'm saying what you went up against was not just another cause. It is a big cause. Am I wrong about this?
Well,
I mean,
I guess I would just say if I were a student in Florida and had been in the school and seen my peers shot down, I mean, I don't,
Yes.
you know, it's
Yes.
different, but I don't know that it's,
okay,
yeah, yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
but it's not skin color. It's not this whole system that is exclusionary
Yeah.
from top to bottom. Do you see? That's where I think it's a different struggle.
You know, I'm having trouble with that. I'm
Okay,
not.
no, that's
I'm
fine.
not.
I may be wrong in all
Well,
this.
I mean, you know, race is such a pervasive issue. You know, underlining everything. I mean, you know, right? The whole country is basically. I agree with you completely. But there's so many intersections. I mean, you know, it was personal to us. Because we're black and we can't change that. I mean, you know, so maybe because it's something that can't be changed, and maybe some of these other things you think maybe things can be changed, but you know, the wrong, and you know, it becomes so essential. It is such an essential element of this country. You know, I'm not even sure. I'm having difficulty. It may be different, but they're all. I mean, at this point,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
no,
we
no, I
certainly have not
understand.
solved the problem,
Right. Well,
haven't solved
that's
any of
what
these
I
problems,
mean.
and
It's
yeah,
just,
yeah, and
Because it's just, no, I'm just really, I think it's an amazing example of what a small group of students at a very well-established, rigid institution can do.
right. But all over
Yes,
at that time, I mean, at
Yes.
every school,
Yeah.
there are all these similar stories.
I agree.
Yeah, yeah.
But what I'm focusing on is on that generation. What that generation did.
But you know, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you, and we're sort of, you know,
Yes,
this is
yes.
silly, but when I think about what my mother, you know, I mean, you think about each generation before us
Absolutely.
and what
Absolutely.
they've done, and
Yes.
you know,
I agree.
right. I mean, so it hasn't. It's
But
gotten
looking
different,
at
but
your
it's,
story,
yeah.
that was
Yeah,
the only
yeah,
reason.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I agree,
Yeah.
and I think, especially that going back to your parents and even their parents. You know, I mean, these are really
Yeah.
amazing,
Yeah,
amazing people.
You know, I talked about my mother and how painful it was, you know, and she kept these letters, you know, these rejection letters, you know, from the 40s. But I think about my father, you know, who, as I said, went to Ohio State, but he had to live in the basement and clean up the dorm. I mean, you know, he couldn't have, you know, and so I mean,
But see, I mean,
Yeah.
yesterday, I think, or sometime, one of the people we were speaking with was talking about Ohio and the racism in Ohio, and how harsh it was, and still is.
yeah.
And so, I mean,
Yeah,
that's what
yeah,
I'm,
yeah.
you know, I'm just touching upon
Yeah.
that, because I think it's a very important story that
Yeah.
has to be told
Yeah.
over and over.
Yeah. And then here we are.